I am your host, Nicole Will, and we thank you for joining us as we navigate the world with your aging loved one. We are here to come alongside elders, family members, and the senior living community as we explore the world of aging and elder care with helpful resources, informative interviews, and approachable conversations. We get to do this together, so join us on our journey, and this is the willGather podcast. Today, we are looking at family and caregiver experiences with senior living communities. Their search for that right community, I think right is in quotes, for their loved one. In my experience, the activities and the life engagement of an older adult is one of the most important factors of that search. A lot of times families are wondering, where do I decide to have them live? We want that older adult to also really enjoy that community and those relationships. So today I'm so happy to introduce you to Sara Kyle, founder and principal at LE3 Solutions, along with Kelly Stranburg, principal at LE3 Solutions. These women have so many years of experience in resident engagement and the well-being space. They are widely known and respected in the senior living industry. They are so passionate about creating a place for education, building morale, bridging the gaps between teams, having that community, looking at what resident engagement programs are and should look like. These women are forward-thinking, focused on education and implementing those metrics, really looking at communication, growing and improving resident engagement programs. They are part of building bridges between departments and the senior living community. We're so happy to have them with us today. Hello, Sara and Kelly. I'm so happy that you guys agreed to do this with me. It was a conversation that I've been wanting to have for a long time. I'm really passionate about it, given my background. It is hugely important to me and has brought me to where I am today. And I know that that's similar for you guys. You decided to start your own company and have this great partnership and really elevate, I believe, our field of life engagement, life enrichment. And I would love for you to speak to that. Tell us how you got here, what little bit about your background and a little bit about LE3 Solutions.
Thank you so much, Nicole, for having us on. I think anyone who knows us knows how passionate we are about the space and what we're doing. And, I continue to say that I wish there was some grand story behind LE3, and I had dreamt about this all my life. But the truth is, it was just the result of circumstances that led us to this, not to dwell back on those, but I think Kelly and I can equally say for over a decade, we saw the lack of value in the community in terms of engagement, and it really just propelled us to move here, whether that was job eliminations, department eliminations. So it was kind of birthed out of, man, we got to do better.
Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely.
And we find ourselves even more driven and more passionate about the impact we could potentially have on aging adults, regardless of their living scenario. If it's a senior living community, great. If it's aging at home or working with home care or rehab companies, we're finding that by coming together to become LE3 Solutions, we're able to have an even greater reach with the amount of impact we can have. And I think that's one of the things that really fuels Sara and I. For so long, we've tried to outwardly not just be proactive in our respective organizations that we were employed by, but we're always consistently speaking and reaching out to other organizations and collaborating with solutions and just trying to really elevate everything that could support somebody in the aging process, whether that's through engagement programs, different solutions. And so we've really been talking about the Sara and Kelly show, if you will, coming together for the last 5-6 years. And now we just find ourselves in this unique position to make that happen. And, you hate to actually say out loud that the pandemic has had some silver linings, but there have been some. And one of them is the fact that organizations are really starting to see how critical the resident engagement piece truly is to day-to-day life. And so Sara and I are just really fortunate to be people who thrive on that and love that and want to just continue to see it flourish.
Yeah, you're right. It is. There have been those silver linings, and I think, right, the whole world really has put a spotlight on people that are isolated in whatever environment that is. And right now it does happen to be, it significantly affected our older adults, and that loneliness piece and that engagement piece. And really, I think in a way, it's holding facilities accountable to how are you meeting those needs. And we have to not only address it with the COVID in a small way, but indefinitely, right? How are we doing that and doing it effectively and doing it well? And there's no excuses anymore. I think we're at this time where it's time, and it's perfectly timed that you guys are in this space. And I think it really, what I see and what I'm so happy about is you're giving it the authority that it deserves finally, really, and speaking to that and giving a lot of people a voice that don't necessarily have one, and teaching them how to do that. So I'm really thankful for that. We're looking at families and caregiver experiences with communities, but also, whether it be people are in their home. And a lot of times families I hear are having a lot of questions. It's already a hard transition to think about moving their loved one into a different living situation. There's a lot of emotions that go along with that. They're wondering if they're doing the right thing. How do they find the right community? And in my experience, I believe that the life engagement of an older adult is one of the most important factors in that search. It's really going to make or break that living, those emotions around their transition, because if you feel welcomed and a part of a community, that makes anyone's experience a little bit better. So we're going to start by, can you walk us through, and I've got some different questions around that. And the first one is, how can families determine their loved ones' life enrichment needs? And when we say that, it's what brings them joy and purpose, and how do they spend their time? And you guys can elaborate on that a little bit more. And why is that important? If we're going to start with looking at our loved one, and then what are we looking for in those communities?
I want to start by giving an example, because what I am learning is that sometimes families don't know best. Mm-hmm. And I will say that from my own perspective of my mom being 70 years old. What I think my mom needs to do and what her life enrichment needs are different than what hers are. Mm-hmm. Right. And I think it's not the same relationship that you have with your children, that you can kind of push and escort them in the way that is best for them in developmental years. It's actually completely opposite of that. And what I believe we have to look at is, what about mom or dad's or loved one's life in their current state, in their current home, is bringing joy and is fulfilling for them, right? We know that people take that with them into communal living, but just because they come from a single one-on-one, home environment into communal living does not necessarily mean they're going to immediately become a lively, outgoing extrovert that is all about everything offered. So I think what you need to look at is, our family expectations of how a resident is going to interact in that setting. There's three things that we know have to happen. Kelly and I talk about this all the time. We have to move. Whatever that movement looks like, just move. There's a strength component there, right? Like we can't just walk ourselves to great health.
Right.
But we have to move and we have to be intentional about it. We have to do things that keep our mind engaged, being creative, being curious, right? And then the last one is just being socially connected to others. And so when you look at those life enrichment needs, and I'll let Kelly expand upon it, those 3 basic needs that we have to look at in the community. Are they offered? How often are they offered? And what does that look like for people who are moving in? There can be a lot of really cool stuff that's going on, but let's start with, the bottom of, we've heard Maslow's hierarchy, tons during this. How are those 3 basic needs met?
I think the one thing I'd also add to our focus of movement, creative curiosities, and making sure we're connecting with others is that those, they need to be present in communal living, but we can also do that at home. And we can do that in our neighborhoods. We can connect with others. We can get out and move, or we can even do safe movements within our own living space. And then I do think a lot of new offerings and solutions rose to the surface this past year of how to keep ourselves engaged intellectually, creatively. I think there have been a multitude of those types of services. What I do think we're starting to see now, which would be appropriate in any type of setting where somebody is aging, is how do you take this idea of virtual offerings and now really start to elevate it so people are connecting in them, and that something is coming of it, and that it's not a passive engagement where you just sit and watch and view and then be like, all right, well, that was cool. I saw that museum. Now what? Is there ways to connect people? Are there multiple people viewing, that space or location at the same time? Can they engage with dialogue with an expert from that place? Can they connect with one another? And so I think we're seeing more of that. And I do think that should be applied in all settings. And it's one of the reasons Sara and I take kind of this, somebody might call it a simplistic 3-prong approach, but there's so much research and science behind, we need to move the bodies, we need to keep the mind engaged, and we must be connecting with others. And this past year has elevated that and highlighted that in a way, we were saying this 13, 14, 15 months ago, but now it is really showing how necessary this is and how much it truly impacts our daily quality of life, whether we are 30, 40, 50, or 80, 90, 100. We all need those 3 areas in our daily life.
Yeah, thank you for really highlighting what is valuable, really looking at those components of movement, engaging our minds, and being socially connected. I think it helps give at least that simple framework, and that's easy for families to remember. Okay, I'm going to look for, does it have these things? And we'll get into it in more depth about kind of what that looks like. But let's say a family member has a loved one in a community. They want to see change. They're not really satisfied. Their loved one isn't really super engaged. What would you suggest? How should they go about that? Maybe asking for things to look differently and approaching those, hard conversations.
So I think if a family is reviewing, there's a few things that they review. A website when they're shopping, right, for their loved one. And I think we need to all admit our websites tell a beautiful story. But then you walk into a community or you pull back the curtain and you're like, that's kind of not what they showed or said on the website. And so I think it is okay to challenge, said provider, said community, and ask, hey, your website said you offer the following. I'm not seeing those types of programs on your calendar you're giving me during my marketing tour, or maybe I've just not seen the connection. So I think you can start there. And then I think it's okay for families to challenge a community and say, I really want to ensure that what you do offer is not to pacify or entertain my loved one, but rather help to elevate their quality of life. This is a tough decision, and we are primarily making it because we want to make sure that they're going to live a better quality of life, because maybe as caregivers, the family, it's becoming more challenging or more difficult. So besides direct care, how else are you going to elevate their day-to-day life? So how do you foster them making new friends or connecting with neighbors? How do you keep their minds stimulated? How are you enhancing their physical well-being beyond walking down the hallway to mealtime, an event, etc.? It needs to be very intentional. And I think the more we can educate families on what is of value when looking at this engagement piece of the puzzle, then they will start to become more comfortable and confident. And you never want to go in and say, hey guys, I'm doing a good enough job, but it's okay to challenge now, especially more than ever, the status quo. Because it's important that senior living continues to evolve and raise the bar in order to truly meet quality of care and quality of life for the residents and families who choose to pursue those.
Yeah, Kelly, when you're talking about either pacifying or, I don't want to say coddling, but kind of doing for, in my mind, if your first encounter with the community around engagement, life enrichment is handing you a calendar and saying, this is what we do, I would question that. And I mean that in a positive way of question that my mom, my dad, my loved one is one of 120 people in this community. How do you know them? Right? I would also say, I'm writing down all this information. You're asking me to fill in information here or there, likes, interests. Where does it go? What do you do with this information I give you? And how is that information for just my loved one taken into account when you're looking at programming and when you're looking at planning things? I would also ask about, how is the resident voice continually heard? Sometimes we hear of families going in and it's like, I really don't like that there's child big crayons. I don't like that there are coloring sheets that are juvenile. I don't like that this bulletin board looks like not very professional. I don't like that activities, big calendars, that they just get crossed out, or why are there flyers hanging up that aren't organized, right? Start to bring that to people's attention. Start to say, this doesn't sit well with me, and ask them why these supplies, why this approach. And it's not that you're calling people out, but what we continue to hear is that I don't think we understand as a large industry and entity how demoralizing some of our approaches are and how offsetting. Again, it goes back to education. And it's a hard role, right? I think anyone who's been at home with their loved ones knows that caretaking it's taxing. And you sometimes lose patience, and you're trying to figure out what to do and what are my answers. And I don't think we can go in with that same lowered expectation in communal living just because maybe it is difficult, right? We have to challenge ourselves. You have to challenge operators and tell them what doesn't sit well with you, right? But then become a partner to elevate it, become an advocate for it.
I also feel like as we have, right, our communities and family members are such a vital part of that, and their experience with us is also their voice and our reputation out into the community, right? They are the first ones to speak to if their experience is positive, if they have frustrations. And so I think it's so important, like you said, we need to hear their voice, and they need to be able to have a space to offer those suggestions and to challenge the status quo, because they're definitely not holding back with their other family members or their friends, from what I found. And I also feel like having a really, really incredible life engagement program doesn't necessarily look like what you had mentioned, really pretty in the website and all of the things. Having a really, really great program is, do people feel really valued and connected and heard and part of, this family that we create, and their family members are an extension of that. I know some of the most powerful relationships I had were not only with my residents, but with those family members, because they have to feel, they're entrusting us in a way with their loved one and that experience. And so we are such a big part of that, fostering that relationship as well, because then that carries out to a bigger relationship with the community and what we're doing and how we're interacting when we are out on an outing or at a restaurant. People can see that. They can tell that dynamic. They are the first ones to I've had family members that have said, I've seen so-and-so community out and they looked like they were so happy and so connected with each other. They can pick up, I believe, on what that engagement looks like.
I would like to piggyback off that, Nicole, because I agree with you that, and it's a difficult skill to sometimes teach to, is, hey, here's how you build relationships. And I think we have a tendency to hire into these different roles, not just life engagement and activity professionals, but all the roles in communal living, with the underlying expectation that, all right, this person interviewed great with me, they'll be great. And when people come into these positions and you onboard to the community and you onboard to the department and then the position, how much time is actually being spent on how to foster connection? How much time do we spend saying, smile at everybody you pass in the hallway? I know for some places that's part of their culture, but do we actually train to this? Tell people it is okay to say hello. It is okay to stop in the hallway when you see somebody you do not know and ask them, hi, my name's Kelly. May I help you? I've never met you. And it is alarming when you work in a community, the frequency at which a majority of staff are not comfortable with that. And so if that's not who you are organically as a person, how can we as the employers, if you will, help to coach and mentor that it is okay to take these types of actions, because that is how you start to foster relationships. And then what kind of questions can you give even care staff as kind of a toolkit, if you will, to get to know their residents better? Programming people and salespeople, we have these processes where we try to get to know as much about an incoming resident as possible, but then how does that push out into the other department? How can housekeepers and servers and maintenance techs also connect? Because they're significant parts of the environment and day-to-day life as well. And so I think if we could sometimes step back and just look at how are we even coaching to that piece of community life, and can we start to put simple actionable items in place as part of onboarding and then ongoing education and training that really helps to develop that sense of community? Because you and I both know, Nicole, if the residents were out, they were probably with an activity professional and they already excel at that. So how can we start to spread that out amongst the departments and amongst the community at large so that it does become more just organic culture?
You really touched on what I think is such a big questions for families in general too, is we know the culture is facilitated by that life engagement and activity director. What role should executives play in that? And you talked about those other departments. I think we're trained on, some education might include how to facilitate different activities and the processes of aging and all of these different things. But you're right. There isn't necessarily that training on human connectedness. How do you make someone feel a part of that community and all of those different pieces? And so should that be a part of, I think it should be, how we train all of our staff in those communities. And there very well could be some of that. There's a lot of different types of organizations. But what is that role of the executive, and how could they also aid in growing that environment?
The number one thing that comes to mind is we're building community. Community is not a department. It's not a role. It's an approach, right? It's a culture. And so it is imperative that everyone's involved. I would put as much emphasis on building community as you do on your communication, right? Communication is the one thing we always want to do well, and we spend so much time and effort trying to get it right. I would say transfer all of that same focus into building community, because it's not going to happen overnight. It takes time, and it takes persistence and a continuous effort.
And when you are building community and people start to have those relationships, those desired relationships, your communication abilities increase. And kind of why we started this conversation was, how can families challenge and have open dialogue about what they observe and what they want for their loved ones? It has to be a strong communication back and forth, but how do we get there? We have to have the rapport. We have to have the relationship. I think anybody listening who has either been a community executive or even a loved one of a resident in a community can attest to, we have to have kind of what I would coin as a prickly conversation. And it's hard. But if the relationship and the fostering of community is occurring, what may have been prickly in one scenario can just be, I'm going to pop my head into the administrator's office. Hey, Nicole, just let you know, Mom said lunch was just not so hot today. I'm not going to complain about it, but I just want you to know she mentioned it in passing, just FYI. Whereas previously that could have been, we're going to have a scheduled meeting. Nicole, I'm going to chew you out. Your dining department's terrible. Mom's upset. Why do we live here? We've all experienced those to some degree, but the more there is that sense of community that filters out into all types of relationships, it impacts the overall experience. And engagement is just a piece of the daily experience puzzle. And so there's a much larger ecosystem occurring here to make sure engagement's the best it can be for our residents.
Right, 100%. And you said that so well. And when there's so much even communication going right out to loved ones and family members, there's that transparency. They feel connected, even though they might not have that communication back as of yet. But when they need to, there's that open exchange that can happen because it exists, right? From the community to those family members. So I probably should have talked about all those terms that we use, and we're going to touch on that of where the profession has been and where it's going. And so typically there's a lot of different language I think that's happening. And there's activity directors, there's life engagement professionals, there's life enrichment, there's wellness. Like, there's so many different titles. I think it can be confusing for families at times. Every different community has a different title that they like to call this person. Starting out, I think a lot of times there was maybe the view of activities, you do activities, right? And it's fun and games and all of those things. So in your experience and your expertise, where have we been and where are we going? And I know that's a big topic, and we could probably take up do a whole nother one on that.
I'm so glad you've asked this question, and it made me reflect back on what I've done in different organizations. And I believe, right, totally my personal opinion, why we have so many titles and names out there is that we've tried to change the name and we've tried to change a job description to improve programming without spending time, resources, effort, or commitment to improving it.
Exactly.
And so we keep thinking if we give it a better name, if we make it prettier, right? You put some makeup on it, it'll just be better. As a family member, you know, Kelly and I, we ask these questions to the actual people who are doing programming. What do you refer to yourself as? And it's really the most basic activities, right? What do residents see you as? They call us activities. No matter what pretty name we put on it, what trademark we give it, at the root of it all, it's activities. Do I think activities is the right word? No, because I think there's so much more to it. But I would go in and, as a family member, ask, who is in charge of how my loved one is going to spend their time and be a part of this community? Right? How are they going to go about their days? After they get great nutrition, they get great care, how do they spend their time? And I don't care what you call it. Just tell me what your approach, your philosophy, and then how do I know it works?
That's a good way to look at it, because that is what it is, really.
And I wish I could have, you know, there's all those things, what would you tell yourself 10 years ago? Twice I went into new organizations and I said, we just need to call it a new name, right? So if you're going into an organization or you're working with an organization and we think that that name would work, I can tell you I've made that mistake twice. And things didn't necessarily change in the program because I changed the name. Right? Yeah. It was actually more disruptive than it was worth.
And you said it's so true. It's like that is what people recognize as a whole, is that activities term. And so while with branding and all of the different things companies could do, at the heart, then we still also have to reference activities, because then that's what's recognizable, right? So then these dual, terms and things like that. You said it so perfectly. Investing in everything else, not the name isn't going to change your program. So with that investment in that program and really wanting to encourage people on their life enrichment journey, let's say, or their activity journey, and their professionals, you and I, we know we're in these different groups, right? Activity professional groups, and they're constantly looking for information and help and resources and things like that. Where can people go that is really helpful and valuable information as they're navigating wanting to change that philosophy for their departments? And I'm also going to ask another side question too, is do you also feel like they're embracing that change to want to have a different philosophy and do better, or is there some resistance?
It's funny. Sara and I talk about this often. I think your greatest resource is right in front of your face, day in and day out, like your residents.
Yeah.
Go sit down and ask your residents, even in this time of a pandemic and isolation, there were still ways to connect and ask them, what do you need? What do you want? And Sara and I have even encouraged that, when people, as states and communities are starting to loosen restrictions, people are diving right back into their former calendars. And Sara and I are like, have you asked the residents what they want first? Like, don't go back in. Let's take small steps back into, full-fledged daily programming. But it's even smaller things than that. I saw a question yesterday in one of the activity groups on Facebook. It was like, hey, what movies do you recommend to air for your residents? 50 people responded. You should have seen the list of movies. You know what I wrote? Go ask the residents.
Right. What do they want to watch, actually?
Who doesn't love a good movie? But it's like, ask them. And why is there this mindset that because they're an older adult, we're going to make sure these are pristine, clean, wholesome. The list of recommendations, great movies, but I'm like, why can't we challenge the status quo? And if there's a curse word in a movie, or maybe some sort of, sex scene, whatever.
Add a disclaimer, maybe.
A disclaimer. And that is, when I used to work in a community, we got to that point where, and our resident base was starting to split, where we have residents who are like, we want the wholesome Disney movies. Sorry, Disney. And then we had residents who were like, no, we want to see all the Oscar nominated films, even if they're controversial, even if there's difficult topics, difficult language, difficult scenes. And so we'd put disclaimers out and we'd have residents every year write a letter to our CEO, what terrible programming people we were, because how dare we hear such things. Going down a tangent on movies. But it's like, but you know what we did? We still had clean, wholesome movies. We still had the Oscar nominated films because we listened to our resident base. Yeah. And we dealt with the fallout that these people have these opinions, these people have these opinions, but we were still serving a greater amount of the population we served. And it's amazing how often we don't just go sit down with our residents, let them bring ideas. And somebody may challenge me and say, well, what about in memory care? How well do you know your residents? Sit down, get to know them. Ask some open-ended questions, not specifically always looking to build out your calendar of offerings, but what kind of things are you getting to know about your residents that could help the entire team in how you provide care? How often are you asking families during quarterly care plan meetings, tell me one interesting fact or piece of information about your loved one who lives with us, and how could that maybe help you provide programming or deliver care? It goes back to how well are we fostering relationships. It's funny, Sara and I are helping facilitate some sessions for a life enrichment virtual conference right now. Regardless of what the focus is with the speaker, whether it's spiritual programming, fitness programming, you name it, the underlying consistent message we are taking away is how are you building relationships to get to know your residents so you can serve them no matter what the tool or program is you provide. It's where are the relationships coming from?
And would you say are professional organizations offering that? Is that a part of that education?
It's so basic, it's not sexy. And it doesn't sell. And it's the one thing that we all have at our disposal that's free, right? And if I don't know where we lost it or where we went away from it, I think the hardest part is operationalizing what do I do with that information when I get it, right? Because usually it stays in heads. There's so much of this relationship that occurs that we do not know about, right? And it's in the 60 to 70% of turnover that we see. So it's always leaving the building instead of staying in place. You know, you mentioned, are people willing to change? I think we're still at a 50-50, right? As Kelly and I continue to read and just stay as close as we can as the people on the front line doing the actual programming work, you know, we can argue it all day. We can throw new tools and resources. We can shout that we're moving, we're changing, it's not going back. But I think the question is really, what are we scared of? What are you scared of being different? And the second question that is, if it's different, is it wrong? If it's different, do you think that you're going to be judged on how well you do your job? Like there is some underlying concern or resentment that is impeding this progress forward. And I'm not real sure, I can't put my finger on it, but I think it's based out of fear. And I think it's, if I don't get back to participation in big events, because that was always the lifeblood of what we sold, then what do I do? What we realized in this is we had been asking volunteers, family members, and different resources to fulfill all of the variations in programming. So we had our people doing art, we had our people leading music, we had our exercise people doing that. When all those are taken away, this one person responsible for programming is having to be all of that. And they're recognizing, one, I knew I was never all of that, but now everyone's seeing that I can't do all of that. And so I have to pick what I'm good at. Right? That's where those tools and resources have to come in and support. And from a management perspective, recognizing that, you know what, Kelly, you are really, really good at physical programming. what resources do you need so we can have a rounded program? And management has to start having those conversations instead of just saying, you know what, you're the activity professional, you're the one leading it, you can do this.
Yeah, you said that so well. And it is that fear and also our ego, right? As humans, oh, I put on this really big event and I had so many people come and it looks really good. And so it's also shifting that perspective of, I value what you do. Okay, from an administrator's perspective, I value what you do and I see you building relationships. I know that you might not have 50 people at an event, but this is what I'm seeing that I know is really fostering that engagement, or however we want to shape that conversation and really talk about, that's an inside job to let go of that ego, I believe. And so having that conversation, and we touched on, not only relationships with our residents, but as professionals, fostering that relationship with those activity directors that maybe are resistant, really getting to know them, what their fears are, what their challenges and concerns are. And when you have that relationship with someone in that rapport, maybe there could be that ability to, okay, you know what, I see that from your perspective, right? It's just like any humans that have maybe disagreements about different things. When you see each other's side of things, you're more willing, and their story and maybe their background, maybe there's a lot that goes into why there's that resistance to change. I'm going to probably have to have you guys come back. I think there's so much more we could talk about. But if we're going to end with that hope for families and life enrichment, what encouragement can you give people? Like, where do you think we're going? What's that future landscape, if you could sum it up?
This is probably not where people are thinking, but in terms of the person day to day doing this front work, give yourself some grace. Celebrate the small successes. Do not get beaten down by what you cannot do. And I think we have to start looking at what are small moments that make the job worthwhile.
Yeah.
Because right now there's not the big fireworks. And there may not be for a while, but there's so many small moments, and those small moments on repeat, I think, will bring so much more gratitude and fulfillment to people. But we have to, Kelly, you'll absolutely recognize this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just slow down a bit. Kelly talks a lot about, we just need to calm down, not take yourself so serious, calm down and look for them because they're subtle. And so, for families, I think it's trust that community living is good, that people thrive with others. Social support of many is much better than social support of one. And you deserve to be able to live your life. But I think I would say trust senior living. Mm-hmm. As much as you've heard and as much as you don't want to, there's so much more good than what's been portrayed in last year.
There really is a lot of good. So many of those moments that are really meaningful and special.
I think the only additional item I would add to Sarah's sentiment is that not only pausing to slow down, but also from our lens, we appreciate everybody who's out there in these roles. And that goes from the activity professional and community to their clinical colleagues, to the family members who have missed their loved ones and have remained resilient and patient during last year. And thank you to those who are providing care at home, because we know how difficult it is. And we never want anyone to feel that we don't recognize how hard the day-to-day work has been, regardless of the living setting. And we just appreciate everybody who continues to give it their all.
Well said. So true. Well, thank you, Kelly and Sara. I'm so appreciative of your insight and look forward to more conversations. I think it's so helpful and so valuable. So thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Nicole. We appreciate you inviting us and allowing us to share.
So I have to tell you about Jimmy Zolo and his new company, Joe and Bella. Our paths had crossed, and I'm so glad they did. It was such a pleasure to meet Jimmy. He is passionate about older adults. He told me that after both of his grandparents moved into a care community, his family's world was turned upside down, and they really became caregivers overnight. As you know, being a caregiver to someone close to you is often overwhelming. There's so much for you to manage, even with the support of a care community, like making sure your loved one has all of the products that they need and keeping them stocked when things run out, keeping inventory on what you have and what you don't. Jimmy also had that problem, and he was scrolling through all of these product reviews across the internet, and like most of us in the sandwich generation, we don't have enough hours in the day. It can feel really overwhelming and time-consuming and frustrating. We don't know what we're always looking for. And he wished there was a way to shop for his grandparents. Then the pandemic hit, preventing visitation to care communities, making this process even more difficult. So Jimmy decided to launch his own business to solve this problem. He founded Joe and Bella to make shopping for older adults simple. They carry everything from comfy clothes to creative gifts. They even have toiletries that can be automatically reordered and tech that makes caregiving easier. Everything all in one location. What I love, and I know you guys will love too, is that each and every product on Joe and Bella has been carefully selected by caregiving experts. Jimmy is so generous. He is giving an exclusive offer to our listeners of our podcast. You can use the promo code GATHER to receive 10% off your first purchase at joeandbella.com. That code is GATHER, GATHER, for 10% off at joeandbella.com. You don't want to miss this offer. Head to their website and check it out. Thank you for listening today. If you enjoyed our episode, please subscribe and give us 5 stars. In all honesty, we'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for listening to our episode.